Today on History's Tech, we are looking at the Northrop F89 Scorpion. Now, besides being one of my favorite jet aircraft of the early Cold War, this rather unique 1950s jet interceptor sets the record for quite a few firsts, being the first jet-powered aircraft designed as an interceptor to enter service, the first combat aircraft armed with air-to-air nuclear weapons, and was one of the first U.S. fighters to carry guided missiles. And while just over 1,000 of these aircraft were developed, it set the stage and the precedent of what an interceptor should be. So let's go ahead and look at the F-89 Scorpion. Now, the origins of the Scorpion can actually be traced back to another Northrop aircraft, the Black Widow. And while the P-61 ended up being a pretty good aircraft in the end, it was time to replace it with something faster and more modern. So the decision was made by the United States Army Air Force, their Technical Air Command, to put out a bulletin for the requirements for a new night fighter. Now, eventually the P-61 turned out to be a pretty good night fighting aircraft, but the decision was made by the United States Army Air Force's Air Technical Service Command for a new night fighter to replace it. And so the request was for a twin-engine, 6-gun aircraft. While it didn't specify jet propulsion because this was still a relatively new technology, it did need to have a maximum speed of 530 miles per hour, which at the time meant that it would likely be either jet or turboprop powered aircraft. Additionally, this aircraft would need the ability to be armed with aerial rockets that could be stored internally, and when it was being utilized as a ground attack aircraft, it needed to be capable of carrying 1,000 pounds of bombs, along with 8 external rockets. Now, throughout the time, they kind of kept adding more and more requirements. It needed to be able to ascend to 35,000 feet within 12 minutes and have a mission radius of about 600 miles. Now, 6 companies put in bids for the development of this aircraft, and in the end, only 3 prototypes were selected for testing. Northrop with their XF-89, Curtiss-Wright with their XF-87, and Douglas with their XF-3D. And so the Air Force actually went ahead and tested all 3 designs to see if any of them would be qualified as a night fighter. So they utilized night fighter pilots, radar operators, and experienced maintenance technicians in order to determine which of these aircrafts would be the best. And the end result was the pilots hated all 3 aircraft. The X-87 was basically seen to be a medium bomber. The XF-3D was seen as a trainer. Pilots did say that the XF-89 was the only one that really had any fighter capabilities, but they didn't like it. The pilots instead wanted to get a Lockheed F-94 Starfire and convert it to an interceptor aircraft. And this is honestly where the story of the Scorpion could have ended. However, the Committee on Evaluation overruled the evaluators and decided to go ahead with the Northrop design as they felt it had the greatest potential. They went ahead and canceled the F-87 design to free up money for the Scorpion, and the Navy adopted the XF-3D to make it their Douglas F-3D. So with an airframe chosen, the Air Force decided to issue a cost-plus fixed-fee contract, which allowed for modifications to the aircraft to improve it to where they actually needed it to be. And these improvements came about. They decided to do some weight reduction on the aircraft, replace it with a more powerful engine that could have afterburners, new radars, new fire control systems, and eventually what would make the F-89 so distinct and well known is they added wingtip fuel tanks. And shortly after these design improvements, the aircraft met with its first issue. The aircraft was being used to participate in an RKO movie known as The Jet Pilot, and while the aircraft was there being utilized for the filming, it developed a flutter in the rear elevators, which actually caused the entire rear tail to break off the aircraft. And this led them to finding out that there was some internal mass balance issues towards the rear of the aircraft, and they actually had to redesign the exhaust in order to prevent this from happening on future aircraft. But with these improvements, the first F-89A was ready to roll out. And while the Air Force did accept this aircraft, they actually wanted to go ahead and make some caveats for the development of the aircraft and some further improvements. The original plan for a swiveling nose gun that had 15 degrees of direction for movement was abandoned in favor of the standard armament of 6 20mm cannons. Permanent wingtip tanks adding 300 gallons were fitted to the aircraft, along with underwing racks that could carry 16 5-inch aerial rockets or 3,200 pounds of bombs. Pretty soon the A models were replaced by B model F-89s. However, these experienced considerable problems with both their engines and other systems, resulting in all of them being withdrawn during 1954. And the improved F-89C had started to be introduced already in 51, also had its operations halted. Therefore, they basically skipped the B and C models and were forced to refit all existing models to try to fix a lot of the structural and engine issues that were appearing on the aircraft. Finally, the definitive model of the F-89 was produced, known as the F-89D model. This aircraft would have its wingtip tanks removed in favor of rocket pods that could carry 50 to 2.75-inch Mighty Mouse rockets, along with its forward cannons being removed in favor of a new fire control system. Now, the aircraft actually got to test these rockets in a first ever situation when they had to scramble from Oxnard Air Force Base in 1956 to shoot down a runaway F-6F drone. This also became known as the Battle of Palmdale. Now, both aircraft that were sent to intercept it fired all of their rockets but failed to hit the Hellcat, which honestly should have been one of those signs that guns were going to be still a necessity on jet fighting aircraft, but the mentality was starting to shift that missiles would be the superiority. The next three variants of the aircraft were never built. There were no E, F, or G models for the aircraft. However, if the G model had been built, it would have carried Falcon air-to-air missiles like the Convair F-106 Delta Dart. Now, the next variant that did get produced was known as the F-89H, and this is the version that actually carried 3 Falcon semi-active radar homing missiles and 3 infrared missiles on board, along with 42 rockets. Now, the final variant of this aircraft, known as the F-89J, replaced the standard wingtip missile pods with fuel tanks once again, just like they used to have, and added a single MB-1 Genie nuclear rocket. Sometimes this would be replaced with Falcon air-to-air missiles. And it is the J model with this Genie rocket system that would become the only aircraft to fire a live Genie missile and the only aircraft to ever fire an air-to-air nuclear missile during the Operation Plum Bob test in 1957. After the J models, the production of the Scorpion ceased at this point. They were relegated to Air National Guard units until 1969, when they would be retired from service. As they were never utilized to ever intercept a Cold War-era bomber flying into U.S. airspace, the F-89 went into service and left service without single combat experience. Today, there are more than 20 F-89s preserved around the United States, including the actual aircraft that fired the Genie air-to-air nuclear rocket in Montana, so you have an opportunity to actually visit the actual aircraft that was part of Operation Plum Bob. But there you have it, a look at an aircraft that was designed to prevent the Soviet Union from ever reaching the United States and was never utilized. But it did allow the United States to test jet interceptors, find out what worked and what didn't work, and was a major part of the United States live nuclear warhead testing, allowing the United States to see what are the capabilities of an air-to-air nuclear rocket. So while the aircraft was never utilized, it did provide useful information to the United States. But that's it for today. Thank you for joining me, and I look forward to talking to you on the next time.